Dr. Colin Ellard. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure, Jackson.
You are an expert in physiography, so the which is the study of, well, actually, what is physiography, and what's the what does it translate to in the real world? What does that look like?
Well, I think the word that you mean is psychogeography. So it's
Psychogeography. Yes, sorry.
the um, in a straightforward way, it's the merger of psychology and geography. So basically, there's a long history to that word, which is not completely relevant. So I won't go into all of the minutiae, but the gist of it is that where you are, your surroundings, what you can see and experience has an impact on your psychological state. So psychogeography
Hmm.
is the science that scrutinizes that relationship.
Is it just me, or have our cities gotten uglier in the past several decades? Because maybe that's just um, how I'm feeling about this, but I don't feel like the cities have been more enjoyable to live in over the past several decades.
I think that what you're describing is certainly something that um, others have expressed. I'm not sure whether there's an increasing trend for ugliness per se, so much as increasing pressure on us to find ways to live with others in high density. And I always say, from the scientific and anthropological standpoint, really, we're not creatures who evolved to live in a setting where large numbers of people are jammed into a small space, as happens in a city. So cities certainly have all kinds of advantages for us, but psychologically they can be taxing. As far as ugliness is concerned, um, I think, I'm not sure whether that's an increasing trend, but I think it's certainly been the case that we have maybe paid less attention to the impact of the appearance of buildings. I mostly specialize in the exterior appearances of buildings, their facades. And I
Yeah.
think we've paid less attention to the impact of those facades. The things that you experience as you are, say, a pedestrian walking through a city, what you see of a city, we've paid less attention to the impact of that part of built design than maybe we should have, because it does can have an impact, either negative or positive, depending on how we build, how we put things together.
Yeah, and the interior design has continued to progress, and things have gotten like you walk into all of these buildings, and they're very enjoyable to be inside as a general rule. But the outside of them, it seems like we stopped improving. I don't know what we're aiming at as far as these buildings are concerned. Like, what is the goal of the outside of these buildings?
Well, I think that something that happened in architecture and design um, was that there was a transformation in the kinds of materials that we were able to use in relatively modern times. For example, the use of glass and steel, especially in concrete, materials that weren't available to us before the 20th century. And so how buildings have been designed, and not just their exteriors, but altogether, have been very much influenced by the kinds of materials that are available to us. So those materials basically are wonderful in the sense that you can make anything. You are freed from a lot of the constraints that apply if you're, say, building with something like stone. But they're also terrible for exactly the same reason, because they give us
Mhm.
the freedom to do things that maybe we shouldn't be doing. So I'm not one of those people, and there are such people in the world who insist that the only good designs are traditional designs, and anything
Yeah.
that's from after, say, the mid 20th century is by definition, because it uses those modern materials, not going to be as good. But I
Yeah.
think that the affordances to be able to do stuff with those materials, like the monolithic skyscraper design that we see everywhere, that's almost featureless. Um, I think that's had a negative impact on the experience, the urban experience, at least from the outsides of buildings.
What is the outcome? What is the what does that trigger in people? What experience is that
Well,
provoking?
in one word, boredom. Um,
Yeah,
Pardon me, I'm just turning off
you're to you're totally fine.
my notifications. Sure, you're going to edit. So, um, okay. So in a word, boredom. Um, when people are exposed to what in my world I call low complexity designs, which is something that you can measure. Um,
Mhm.
if you look at their psychological state and even their physiological state, you can see that exposure to those designs has an impact, and
Mm,
that impact, it's the signature is that if you are looking at something that you don't like for whatever reason, and also something that is unarousing, in the sense of producing nervous system arousal. That combination is the absolute signature for boredom.
mm,
And boredom, we know, is bad for you. Oddly enough, if you subject people to chronic boredom in a laboratory setting, and there are some nice studies showing exactly this, um, that they secrete higher levels of cortisone, the
mm,
or cortisol, the stress hormone. And we know that an abundance of cortisol is something that's generally a bad thing. I mean, cortisol is a great thing to have in your body when it's needed, but if its levels are high all of the time, it leads to stress-related disease, metabolic disorders, cardiac disorders, and so on. So it's not really too much of a stretch. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that those kinds of low complexity or boring designs, if you will, over the course of long exposure, um, let's say that you live or work in a neighborhood that's filled with these kinds of designs, that's going to have a measurable impact on your state of health.
mm,
So I think, nobody's ever so far drawn explicitly those links between the amount of complexity that you're exposed to in the urban environment and your state of health. But I'm sure that eventually we will do just that and show that just as we have in other realms. So another example is if you look at the work that's been done that measures the effect of exposure to nature on people's physiological and psychological state, there's clear evidence there that if you live in a neighborhood that has has an abundance of vegetation, trees, boulevard trees, other kinds of plantings, it has a positive impact on your health.
mm.
And and so we just because we haven't done that yet for other features of the environment doesn't mean that we won't find those effects. And I think based on my own measurements of the short-term effects of those exposures, we'll see exactly the same kinds of things. That the way we build and design affects our health.
Yeah, and it does seem that a lot of our cities and places that we live in day to day have just become less pleasant to be in. Um, when visited Europe, a lot of the time, those cities are just as large, but they're much more enjoyable to be in.
Yeah, I think that I think I'd be a little bit guarded about making that kind of a generalization because again, I'm
Mm,
leery of falling into this kind of generic argument that classical architecture is the only architecture that can promote wellness. So when people talk
true.
about comparisons between Europe and North America, a lot of the time they're talking about the fact that in Europe we have much more heritage architecture than we do in
Yeah.
North America, and obviously that's true. But I think there can be very fine modernist architecture
Mm,
that is psychologically positive.
yeah.
Um, so I mean, I think it's quite nuanced. I think that there are, I mean, I think the thing that we all struggle with is that we know that we have to find ways to live with high density. I already
Mhm.
talked about that a little bit. And there are many different ways to do that. So, um, one way to do it is to build high, and in North America we've done that a lot. But there are other ways as well, where medium density, say housing development, for example, can work just as well as high rises, and
Mm.
maybe is more psychologically positive. So I'd be a bit leery about making too much of a generalization that hinges on a fondness for classical design, as
Yeah.
opposed to looking at what features are in a design that might make it psychologically healthy.
Yeah, and maybe that's just my own, preference, as I do enjoy the European heritage design. I wonder how much preference plays into this conversation in general.
Yeah, I think, well, I would say certainly that um, well, as a psychologist, I'd always begin this discussion by saying that we're much more similar than we are different. But that
Mhm.
being said, of course, we have differences in preference. I have some very good friends who adore brutalist design, which
Mm.
is you can find high complexity in brutalism, but it takes more of a practiced eye to see it. Um, and that's personal. Sometimes it has to do with the way that we approach particular kinds of designs as well.
Mm.
Um, yeah,
It is, yeah, I do wonder if, building I mean, I see why we decided to build up as opposed to, say, out, just because then you were closer to the river source and things were much more packedly dense, and so or densely packed, and so you could things were much easier to get to and things like that. But yeah, I also wonder what if that was the right decision.
I think again, part of it has to do with materials. We build high now because we can.
Hmm.
You're right that there are certainly advantages that come from having high density. I mean, if you think about why cities work, I mean, historically, you're right that it might have had to do with things like finding ways for as many of us as possible to be close to a resource like um, I think you said a river, but it's also about um, proximity to one another. So it's kind of this weird double-edged sword in the sense that being living in a sea of strangers as we do in cities is psychologically taxing,
Mm.
but it has advantages. I mean, if you think about your own life, your ability to be able to reach out and be with other people, lots of other people, quickly for purposes of work, recreation, what have
Right.
you. That's a good thing. It's a good thing to have that kind of access. And so there's an argument to be made that one of the root conditions of a city is, I mean, to put it in kind of a crass commercial way, it's about the speed of transactions.
Hmm.
That if you can encounter a lot of people or things quickly, then you can get more done. I hate the word productivity in a way, but you can
Yeah.
increase your productivity.
Right.
So I think that's in part where cities have come from. Cities grew up for all kinds of reasons, but I think the height part, a big part of it is because we can. And again, thinking of those classic traditional designs in Europe where sometimes there's high density without high rises. I think of something like um, the suburbs of a city like Paris, or
Mm.
a better example might be Stockholm, where there's nice high density, but with fewer high rises. There are other ways to do it, but you know, high rises work, and they're
Yeah.
economically fairly tractable.
Yeah. And I wonder. I mean, you've talked about the effect simplicity has on the amount of boredom in our lives, but there are some designs that are really aesthetically pleasing and also and part of that aesthetic pleasing is because of their simplicity. Is does all simplicity lead to boredom, or is there kind of is it a gradient?
Yeah, it's more nuanced, isn't it? So you're right. I mean, there are um, elements of simplicity that we do find attractive. Think of something like symmetry, for example. We are
Yeah.
attracted to symmetry, and that's probably biological. And so that you can see that as kind of a contradiction, I suppose, to the idea that we like complexity. But it's not really, because there can be more than one thing that attracts us. So, and sometimes people in design talk about this is a big thing in interior design. People talk about organized complexity. So
Mm,
you can have a design that has lots of features, so it's complex in that sense, but there's an order to them that makes that complexity more um, makes it easier to apprehend it as a thing. So again, like you can see that as a contradiction, but you can also see it as complexity being just one element that might affect our preference for particular kinds of environments.
yeah. What are the things that are indicative of a enjoyable or pleasant or um, humane sounds wrong because that has connotations and has other meanings for that word, but a humane design.
Well, I think we've already talked about complexity, order in the sense of organized complexity, symmetry. Another aspect of the environment. Again, I'm kind of thinking of interiors at this point, but not, I guess this is not just interiors. Curvature has a surprisingly positive impact on people's
Hmm,
um, responses to towards spaces. I
hmm,
think, one of the things that's important to recognize about this is that um, it can be problematic to think about how to design an optimal space in terms of there being this alphabet of features that, if I get
hmm.
the following five factors right, then I will have the best environment that I can have. Because
Right.
there are all kinds of strange nonlinearities between these factors. So it can be very hard to predict how particular combinations of features might have an impact on people's responses to them, without first putting them together. That's
Hmm,
kind of I know that's a little bit of a wishy-washy argument to say, well, we don't know if, I mean, I can't give you the comprehensive list of things that we need to do.
yeah.
But I think it's nevertheless the case that, we can identify things like the ones that I've mentioned to you, form, symmetry, curvature, complexity, order, um,
Hmm.
and others. But that doesn't mean that I can then give you a formula and say, okay, look, do the following things and people will love this environment. It's a little bit hard to predict in that fashion.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I would imagine there's an element of we know what not to do, and we can kind of draw from inference that, okay, then if we do these things, it's probable that, we're gonna like the outcome.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. I think, I have a friend and colleague. He's an architect. His name is Ty Farrow, and he's been arguing, I think, with great merit recently that in fields like mine, there has been maybe too much emphasis on things that we're doing wrong. So when I've
Mm,
published about the influence of facade complexity on people's responses, I've published in the context of, look, if we go too low on complexity, then I can show you measures of human responses that indicate that this is bad for you. And
mm,
Ty says, let's flip all of that because we're not really interested in environments that are bad for you. Interested in environments that actually promote health. So there's a word for this that's being used more and more, which is salutogenesis. So let's make salutogenic environments that actually are settings that promote good health.
Hmm. And those part of the part of what I'm thinking here is, and this may be completely wrong, and I don't want it to sound crass at all, but it almost sounds like some of the things that you're mentioning that go into designing a really beautiful exterior for a building, one that is enjoyable to be around, one that kind of creates positive emotions in us subconsciously, is that it resembles some of the characteristics of the human body. And that might be completely incorrect, but that does seem to be uh, a possible comparison here.
Yeah, there's yeah, a few people have talked about that, exactly that kind of connection. Um, it's a variant of what is sometimes called biophilic design. So we know that we have an intrinsic attraction to things that are alive, and one of the things that we're most attracted to, of course, is one another. So again, if you look at things like even classical designs, like classic column design in Greek and Roman architecture, you can see ways in which parts of those designs resemble parts of the human body.
Mm,
Um, Something else that people talk about all the time is something called pareidolia, which is a, a fanciful word just for the fact that we tend to see faces in lots of things that aren't really faces. And again, the argument is that we've got um, uh, brain hardware, which is true, that predisposes us to recognize faces. And
mm,
that it makes obvious sense that we would have stuff like that because one of the most important things that we do is recognize other people and also recognize how they're feeling by looking at their facial expressions.
yeah.
So then the argument is that when we appreciate architecture, maybe part of what we're doing is that we're pointing these evolved devices that we have for doing faces or bodies at pieces of buildings. And so, in
Mm,
that sense, again, it makes sense that we'd be attracted to things that remind us of
mm,
those forms. Um, I wish I could remember the name of the feature, but I have another colleague who wrote about a particular part of the design of a church, the altar of a church, which had lots of twists and turns and curvature, but of a particular kind that he said actually resembles. He said, if you look at it, it's like a human body actually being twisted. And
mm,
at the altar, the idea was that would resemble the agony of a crucified Jesus. And so he
right.
said the reason why people have such an emotional, a visceral response to that altar is because they can literally feel the pain of that person being twisted in that
Mm,
setting. So again, I mean, the idea is um, that yes, that we are predisposed to be attracted to and interested in human or animal forms, and so where you see
yeah.
those things in design, you're likely to have usually positive responses to them.
Yeah. And I wonder if we have. I'm a Christian, and I believe that God created us. So I don't buy the evolution thing, but I do wonder if we have been created and we see stories created to see stories and everything. And maybe that's part of the reason why we don't enjoy some of these buildings as much, is just because there's no complexity or interest to them. It's just here's this monolithic structure that just serves the purpose of utility and efficiency and productivity. And there's no like, if you look at, some buildings, you can see that, like, the building is angry. Is, like, the best way I can say it is you can see the emotions of the building. It's angry, or, it's a comforting building, if that makes sense, or it's a grand building, and there's no story in these monolithic structures.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, first of all, what you said about a building being angry reminds me of some work um, by someone named Ostwald, who took, there are computer algorithms that can be pointed at faces, and we think, I mean, I don't buy into this completely, but we think that we can tell certain things about the machines can tell certain things about how a person is feeling by measuring their facial expressions.
Mm,
And this is something that's in use in various places throughout the world. The tech world is very interested in these kinds of algorithms. And so what Ostwald did was to take that kind of software and point it at buildings. And the thing that I'll always remember
mm,
is that he pointed it um, at a particular building designed by, oh my goodness, I'm blocking on the name of that architect because I'm old, but it might come to me as I think about the building. Um, it was a modernist building, a very famous modernist building, and the the computer algorithm recognized the facial expression as one of anger. I mean, it wasn't a
mm,
face at all, but if you point these algorithms at things, then whether they're faces or not, they'll spit out a result. So it reminded me of that. And the other thing that you talked about was the idea that buildings have stories that either attract us or not. And I think that's, I mean, as you said that, I was thinking about it in a different kind of context. I think, apart from the physical features of a building, um, our understanding of the the history, the story of a building also has a contribution to our emotional response to it. So I was thinking of it
mm,
more along. Well, I'll give you the example that came to mind. I studied years ago, really when I was first starting out in the kinds of experiments that we're talking about today. I was studying some buildings in New York City in the Lower East Side, and I was looking for examples of low complexity designs to measure their effects. And I came upon this, what to me was quite an unattractive building. It was an affordable housing complex, and it was very basic cinder block construction. There were some elements of what people call hostile architecture, which is basically code for design elements that are meant to prevent people from lingering in place.
mm,
Um, and so I found this building. I thought, well, this is it. This is, a building that I can use as an example for the work that I was doing of low complexity, bad, if you like, design. And one of the things that I remember most about this is that the responses that I got from people when I stood them in front of this building were different depending on who they were and where they were from. So
mm,
when people like me, somebody from Canada, living in a different kind of city, a different kind of world, came to that building, I would see it as, they could have done better. This looks a bit like a prison block. And people from, we had tourists from Europe who were in the study as well, and they had the same kind of response. But people who lived in that area saw that building in a completely different way because they knew stories. They knew people who lived there. They,
mm,
they noticed things that, whereas a stranger, an outsider might come to the building and notice the wire protection over the windows, the stenciled on numbers on the buildings, again like prison blocks. The people who lived in the area noticed things like the playground. They noticed some of the subtle, sometimes very informal decorative elements like graffiti, even.
mm,
Um, and so for them, it was more personal, and the the raw physical appearance of the building mattered less.
mm,
So, I mean, that's a different way of thinking about a building telling a story. There's
Yeah.
another example that I can think of. I did a study in Red Hook in Brooklyn, and we were walking in Red Hook is a very interesting area because well, I haven't been there for quite a while now, but last time I was there, it was very mixed. So there's a lot of public housing. There are some small pockets of gentrification. There's
Mm,
still some industrial stuff, industrial buildings that harken back to um, Red Hook's heritage as a shipping area. And so one of the buildings that I was studying was it was basically designed as a warehouse. It was on the water. It was old, but still kind of a monolithic design. But the one thing that really stood out about that building is that even though it was just straight walls with very few windows, there were these tiny, almost unnoticeable design flourishes in the walls of the building, like little decorative sculptures, tiny things that
mm,
were just studded from here and there on the surface of the building. And one of the people that I was looking at the building with, we noticed these things, and they said, you know, um, what this tells me is that whoever built this thing actually cared. They might have been building a warehouse, but they cared about what they were building enough to put these elements on it. And so, I mean, maybe that's another example for me of a building that tells a story about its designers.
yeah.
That they made it to store whatever it was meant to store, but they also took pride in what they'd made, and they wanted people to actually admire their building, so they included these features. And I think
Yeah.
that's something that you can do with any kind of architecture. It's not always done, but I think um, that's something that's available for a designer to do.
Yeah. And I wonder how much that has an effect on the I don't know what the right word is. Is it, are we looking for enjoyability? Are we looking for comfort? I don't know what we're trying to reach here. But I wonder if that kind of uh, pride of the artist visible in the building has, if that has an effect on how we enjoy the building.
I think it does. I think it does. I think it one of the things that I think both of the things that you described, enjoyability and comfort, are important. Also, things like attachment. I mean, one of the things that you want to have happen in an area where people live is that you want people to feel a sense of attachment to that community for a bunch of reasons. Um, Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the screaming in the background. My toddler is
It's okay.
with a babysitter, and they're being very, very vocal right now. Um,
It's totally okay. I'll mute them out.
okay. Um, so yeah, place attachment is super important. If we feel attached to a place, we will take care of it. We will take care of one another. If we don't feel attached to a place, then we're much less likely to do that. And that's a story that, as far as I know, had its origins in um, the work of an architect named Oscar Newman, who wrote a lovely book called Defensible Architecture. And um, the the idea was basically to he looked at he compared public housing that either worked or didn't work. And he said, what is the difference between a public housing setting that doesn't work? And there was this notorious building called the Pruitt-Igoe building in St. Louis that ultimately was knocked down because it was a disaster. And he compared Pruitt-Igoe with another nearby piece of housing that was successful. And he said the difference between the two had to do with the geometry of its design. It was something so simple as to find a way to design a setting that would encourage people to feel ownership of that setting. And if we have ownership at some level, we feel attached. And when we feel attached, we not only take care of the space, but we take care of other people who are using the space. It becomes a community, in other words.
Yeah,
Um, so I mean, that's one of the, at least for areas where people live, and not everything is about, there are central business districts as well, where typically very few people live there. But for the areas that we want people to cherish as their homes, finding ways to develop that sense of attachment is super important to
yeah.
do. And I think the things that you were talking about, like enjoyment and ease or comfort, um, those are also factors that can contribute to that feeling of ownership and attachment.
Yeah, and I really like the word cherish here. I think that's a great word here of like this is your thing. This is your building, your house, your apartment, your whatever it is. And you really want to take care of it and make it more. I mean, you can tell a lot about a person based on the building, based on, you know, their room or their house or something like that. And so you want to make it more like you and more enjoyable to be around and things like that. I think I really like that term there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. One of the most effective ways of building place attachment in a community is participatory public art. And
Hmm,
I think the reason that it's so effective is because it does exactly what you're describing, that it gives people a way um, to imprint themselves into, literally into the setting where they live, and to do that as part of community is a wonderful thing. So it's surprisingly potent.
yeah. How much of the angry architecture are we able to overcome psychologically by means of attachment to the people or stories or situations that happened in these locations? I mean, you mentioned the affordable housing um, projects and the people who lived there had certain like oh yeah, they remembered this fondly or they saw the good parts of it. How much are we able to do that in other areas of our life around these buildings?
I don't know. I don't know if anybody has a good answer to that question. I mean, based on my experience of that one public housing project, one might be tempted to argue that we can do quite a bit to overcome the psychological impact of bad or ugly design. But I just had this interesting conversation with my wife just before I came on with you today, and she was asking me about um, whether people become um, inured to beauty. So um, whether, if you are lucky enough to live or work in a really exquisite setting, whether you get to a point where you're just kind of like you forget it.
Hmm,
So people ask
yeah,
this a lot about. We've done some research on the emotional experience of awe, and so the question is, if let's say that you're a security guard in a
the
spectacular,
Louvre or something like
the
that.
Louvre.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, I was going to say the Louvre or Notre Dame, somewhere like that. Does it get to the point where it's just like ho hum? And and I I don't think anybody knows. I think that
mm,
that's a really important question. And then the counter, and I said, I suspect maybe we do become a bit inured to it. And she threw back at me that she said, you worked in a building, and this is true, I did. I don't have an office in this building anymore. She said, this is a stupendously ugly building on the university campus where I worked. And she said, you never had a positive thing to say about it. She said, you never became inured to the ugliness of that building. So,
yeah,
why was that the case? And you do believe that we become inured to beauty. This is all
yeah,
anecdotal. I don't think anybody knows the answers to these questions. I'm certain that I don't. Um,
yeah.
but
I
there,
think that the yeah, I think that the exceptional becomes mundane without gratitude. if you aren't thankful for continually thankful for um, the beauty of the Notre Dame as a, as a security guard there, I think it can become mundane. And I also think that if you don't have a personal story or a connection or attachment, like I worked to help create this thing, then yeah, it can become mundane. But I might imagine that if you like if you take your house, and let's say you built your house and you completely designed the interior and you did all the work on it, I don't know that you would ever I think it would be less likely that it would become mundane for you because you have so much that you've invested into it.
Yeah, that's a couple of interesting points there. What you just said about participating in the building of your own place reminded me again. This goes back a long time in my history, but I once owned this old house that had some problems, and one of the problems that it had was a leaky basement. And I cursed often the day that I ever bought this house because it was such a difficult house to maintain. And so I decided, the basement flooded. My wife said, uh, we're going to have to, call a contractor. We need backhoes. They need to dig everything up. And I said, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it
Mm,
myself. So I dug this gigantic crater beside my house. And I remember, this sounds completely strange, but I would go and sit inside this hole and I would put my hand underneath. I remember sitting there thinking, my hand is actually underneath the foundation of my house. And I never felt like I owned that house until then. And then
huh,
I fixed the leak. And then that
yeah.
house became mine because of that kind of contribution. The other thing I was going to mention was that for some reason this keeps coming up, and maybe it's been contextualized by you're mentioning the Louvre, but and it has to do with this idea of gratitude, maybe in part, but also how you approach your relationships with things in your life, whether they're places or not. I just finished a book. I'm just peering over my desk because I can see it on the floor. It's called All the Beauty in the World by Patrick Bringley. And this is probably what triggered me to mention a security guard. So Patrick Brinkley it's a fantastic book.
Mm,
He was working for the New Yorker. He got his dream job, which was, I think, ultimately to be a staff writer for the New Yorker, and he became quickly disillusioned with his choices. And there were other things going on in his
mm,
life as well, which prompted him, somewhat astonishingly, to quit his job at the New Yorker and take a job as a security guard at the Met Art Museum in New York City.
mm,
And the reason that this is relevant is because what makes this book such a fantastic book, made it for me a fantastic book, was that he talks about um, a lot in the book about his relationship with certain pieces of art that he encountered in the Met. And as a security guard, he had the opportunity to stand or sit in front of these objects for sometimes hours and to let their effect wash over him. And as I was reading this book, and he talks a bit about this in the book, was thinking about, the idea of the gallery or museum experience. When you go to a setting like that, you you're accepting an invitation to go into this building as a way of, however you do it, communing with certain pieces of art. And so all of that context sets you up for a situation where your job, if you put it this way, is to to go into that building and to find objects and to strike up relationships with those objects, to
mm,
let them have an effect on you. And so as I was reading this, I was thinking, is there scope for, I'm not sure if that has to do with gratitude, but I think maybe it does a little bit. Is there scope for taking that kind of attitude into more of your life? So rather
mm,
than saying, okay, because I'm in the Met or whatever gallery or museum you're in, my job here is to have aesthetic experiences. what if I brought more of that into my everyday life? What if
Yeah.
my walk down to the corner shop also became an opportunity for me being grateful, if you like, for whatever I encounter on the way. Just the
Mm.
simple everyday objects of life, the tree,
Yeah.
the crack in the sidewalk, how it got there, the sounds, whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm just on a random meander here or not, but
No, no, I think you're hitting something that like the love of life is kind of maybe that's the best way I can think of to describe it is the love of being alive.
yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, I've written a lot in some of my more scientific stuff about, I guess it's scientific, about what have called vitality, that we are intrinsically attracted to vitality. And
Mm.
one example of that we talked about earlier is biophilic design, that we like to see, to experience the patterns of nature. But I think the reason that we like that's just a very simple example of something deeper. And that, as you just said, it's because we love the feeling of being part of life. It's all
Yeah.
sounds some trite to put it that way, but I don't think it is trite. I think it's kind of deep. So yeah, it's about an attitude. It's less about, again, as I've been thinking with the museum experience, it's less about it being some kind of specialized facility that we um, uh, cultivate for certain kinds of experiences, and more about bringing all that into more of your life. Sometimes in my part of psychology, people have talked about what's sometimes called the evaluative stance. So the evaluative stance is where, let's say you do an experiment where, I've done lots of experiments where I'll bring people to a building and I'll say, okay, stand in front of this building for 5 minutes. And then, I'll measure them and then I'll ask them for their reflections, et cetera, et cetera. That's an evaluative stance because I'm bringing them to this place and saying, okay, here's what you do. And that's thought to be different to just your kind of everyday immersion and experience as it happens, where I think maybe sadly a lot of the time you're just not all that aware of your surroundings. But I
Yeah.
feel like it's a good idea to kind of merge those things together, so that now I know that I am meandering because I'm getting a little tired, but hopefully you can see my point. I think you can.
No, I can, and I think that humility also plays a role here. C.S. Lewis defines humility as not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. That you spend less time um, thinking about you and more time about other things in the world. I think that's probably why enjoyment of life goes. One of the reasons why enjoyment of life goes up when people get married or get into a relationship or have kids is their life is suddenly filled with another person very deeply, and so they stop thinking about themselves as much, and they start thinking about other people and the world around them. And Yeah, I think I have an idea that beauty inspires greatness, and if you but the world is really beautiful all around. And so I don't know, tying this all back in, what can people do to start making our buildings, our world that we live in, more beautiful, more enjoyable, and more pleasant to be in?
I think there's one thing. I mean, most of us are not designers. Most of us are not involved in the building trades, but we are all participants in all of the processes that eventually culminate in our built environment. So the one thing is, and this is basically what's driven almost everything that I've done in my professional life, the one thing is for us to just cultivate an awareness of that. So
Mm.
if you understand the impact that the design of your surroundings has on you, then that makes it more likely that you're going to advocate for for better designs. developers respond to what I hate the word consumer, but I'll use it anyway in this context. Developers respond to what, let's call them clients, what their clients want.
Yeah.
Architects respond to developers. So everything begins at the grassroots level with the client. If people know what makes them feel good, if they take the time to reflect on that, to introspect, examine their own experiences, and use some simple tools that I've tried to provide here and there along the way for people to be able to do that, then that creates demand, and that demand is where it all begins. So I
Yeah.
think that's the most important thing.
Yeah, and obviously not everyone like I don't have the ability yet to go contract a developer to build a house that is according to my needs and likes. But yeah, I'd be curious what like small things can you implement in your day-to-day life that put into your day-to-day life that will kind of increase the amount of joy you have in your surroundings.
I think it depends on the scale. I mean, if you're thinking of your own home, for example, then a super simple thing is to think about that intrinsic attraction that we have for biomorphic designs. So even things as simple as plants or pieces of art in your environment. I mean, artworks in your home are not. It's an undersell to say they're decorative. They're much more than that. They're actually therapeutic tools to change the way that you feel.
Hmm,
Um, so I mean, think of your interior designs in that sense.
yeah,
Um, in terms of the wider world, one of the ideas that I really like um, is that I mean we're all really busy. We have lots of things that we have to pack into a day usually, and so we become obsessed when we're doing something like planning a simple um, walk from one place to another. Let's keep it super simple. We think in terms of, I mean, a lot of people use GPS apps of one kind, or Google Maps or whatever. It tells us the quickest way to get somewhere. Um, Take the time when you can to not select the quickest way, but the nicest way, the most scenic way, the way that's going to take you through more life. So, like an easy example from my own life is that I live within walking distance of the downtown core of the small town where I live. And I can walk there directly along a fairly noisy thoroughfare, or I can walk through the park, which takes about 10 minutes longer. And the state that I'm in when I get to the downtown, if I walk through the park, is so abundantly and obviously different that it's worth the time. So
yeah.
think about those kinds of transactions in your everyday life. I had again one of that experiment that I was telling you about in New York City. I had this deer. I often take people for walks and measure them and ask them questions. And this dear woman, an elderly woman, said, I'd taken the group into a community garden. And at the end of the whole experience, she said, from, I walked this route basically every day, and I never knew that this garden was here. And she said,
Hmm,
now I will never walk past this garden without going in to enjoy the experience that I just had. So
yeah.
it's again, it sounds a little trite and obvious, but take the time. Think about more than getting through your life with blinding speed.
Yeah, I think the American desire to optimize for efficiency and productivity has hurt our enjoyment of life. And yeah, we build things. We the actions that we take are generally designed to just be to do the thing the fastest, the most productive, the most efficient, as opposed to um, it's not necessarily stopping and smelling the roses, but going through. Um, taking routes, building places, spending extra time and money to uh, enjoy the world that God has given us. Um, I think that'd make a tremendous difference if we started doing that,
Mhm.
as opposed to just ruthless productivity and efficiency.
Agreed.
Yep. Fantastic. Where can people find yourself and the book online? And I think you've written a couple other books as well, and go learn more about this.
Yeah, my website is colinellard.com. That's kind of the good starting point for anything. I have my most of my most recent writing is on a Substack, which is called The Wandering Brain.
Hmm.
So people can take a look there.
Fantastic. And I will link the Places of the Heart, which is the book all about this, in the description as well, and people can go check that out.
Great.
Dr. Colin Ellard, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate the conversation.
My pleasure, Jackson.
Thanks so much. See you guys.